There we are. Good evening, everybody. I'm Alan Short, the president of Clare Hall, and a very, very warm welcome to the 2024 Tanner Founders Lecture on Human Values in Cambridge, which we know in the college as the Ashby Lecture, in honor of our patron, Lord Ashby, Master of Clare and Vice Chancellor, who was clearly a great friend of our benefactor, Obert Clark Tanner. And I need to say that if the fire alarm goes off, it will be a real alarm, and all of those watching on Zoom will marvel at the discipline and military precision we live attendees exhibit as we flee into Robinson's beautiful gardens. We're delighted that Stephen Tanner Irish, who's assumed the chair of the Tanner Lectures Board, is watching the event remotely. It's most welcome. We hope that we'll see you again, Stephen, in person in Clare Hall before too long. So Clare Hall is particularly privileged to have hosted the Tanner Founders Lecture at Cambridge University since 1978. In fact, the first ever Tanner Lecture was held here in that year. And Obert Tanner wrote at the time, "I hope these lectures will contribute to the intellectual and moral life of mankind. I see them simply as a search for a better understanding of human behavior and human values." And so now Tanner Lectures are held annually at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Berkeley, Stanford, Utah as the Tanner home base, Michigan, and Linacre College in Oxford. And this evening, we are really delighted to welcome the distinguished medieval historian, Professor Daniel Weiss, the immediate past president and chief executive officer of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York between 2015 and 2023, and now Homewood Professor of the Humanities at Johns Hopkins University. He's had two spells as a college president as well, of Lafayette College and Haverford College. I like to think that I can always detect former college presidents. There's something in their demeanor, heightened vigilance, perhaps. Professor Weiss's title is The Ethical Museum, Reflections on Cultural Mission and Civic Responsibility. Leading the world's great museums is a sometimes perilous activity. Professor Weiss's book, Why the Museum Matters, was published by Yale University Press last summer. And in effect, his valedictory comments on 8 years at the Met. He describes the special obligations of museums as stewards of our cultural history and therefore perpetual institutions, as we like to describe our colleges here. He explains the rather modest origins of museums in the United States, fundamentally different to those in Europe, based on immense royal and aristocratic collections here, involuntarily gifted to or recovered by the state. And when I met Daniel in his spectacular rooftop headquarters on Park Avenue, he skipped through the challenges of the last 8 years at the helm. The COVID epidemic, which lost the Met a vast amount of income, coming on top of historic budget pressures, necessitating cuts in staff, and the inevitable impact of all of that on morale, all tracked by the media in real time. Diversity and inclusion issues, the response to the immense damage done by the Sacklers pharmaceutical empire. The Met led the rejection of their immense campaign of patronage, the rejection of Saudi munificence after the assassination of Khashoggi. But good things happened too. The largest ever gift received by the Met for the $125 million Tang wing, the modern wing, and a bracing run-in with President Trump over UNESCO. I asked Daniel about the differences between a national museum largely sustained by state funding and a museum funded almost entirely by gifts, donations, and its own income generation. Selene and I discovered that these differences are amply reflected in the price of sandwiches on offer. So after Daniel has spoken for about 50 minutes, we'll have a 10-minute break to recover, and then the former director of the National Museums of Scotland and the British Museum, Robert Anderson, will join him in conversation for 45 minutes or so. And if there's time, and we very much hope there will be, we will take questions from the audience. And so, Professor Weiss, Daniel, we hugely look forward to your lecture.
Thank you so much. It is an immense pleasure to be here and an honor to have the opportunity to be at Clare Hall, where I am for the week, to deliver the Ashby Lecture for 2024. Before I begin my remarks, I want to express my gratitude to the Tanner organization, to President Short, to the wonderful staff at Clare Hall and throughout Cambridge who have made Sandra and I feel so welcome being part of this community. it has been a very special moment. And it isn't over yet. I have to do this, and then we have the rest of the week as well to enjoy our time here. My remarks this evening concern the museum, both the overarching idea that inspired the museum movement as we understand it and see it in the world today, as well as the various obligations and challenges that are before the museum world. I'm going to speak in some detail about them and how we might confront them. For various reasons, which we will explore in my remarks, we might view the museum as an idea comparable to the university, particularly with regard to intellectual ambition, governance structure, social purpose, and historical legacy. With that in mind, I note with a combination of admiration and humility that this university, where I have the privilege to deliver this lecture, has been fulfilling its civilizing and scholarly mission for more than 8 centuries. To be sure, Clare Hall is just behind that, but also eminent. Although we generally recognize the museum as a younger kind of institution, an 18th century product of the Enlightenment, I would argue that the origins of the museum are far older and to be found in ancient Rome during the time of Cicero, Caesar, and the hero of our story, Gaius Asinius Pollio, who almost certainly created the first truly public museum within the Atrium Libertatis, the Hall of Liberty in Rome, during the difficult period of the perilous interval between the fall of the Republic and the emergence of the empire under Augustus. I'm going to come back to this idea that museums fulfill a fundamental role in society, just as they did at that time and in that place. In light of such a rich and complex history, museums as we recognize them today are also like the university, living institutions that have evolved across countless generations and disparate societies to become, in their current form, among the most resilient and consequential of our cultural achievements, and perhaps as important today as they were in the difficult time of Asinius Pollio. Before turning to the current state of the museum, and in particular the nature of its challenges and ethical obligations, it is worth saying something about what a museum actually is, if indeed there is a single definable entity. Beyond serving as the repository of some kind of collection, museums exist in countless varieties, depending upon the content of their holdings, their particular histories and legacies, their current acquisition practice, if indeed they are collecting, their form of ownership, government-owned, independent, not-for-profit, university-affiliated, and private are among the major categories, and the character of their specific missions, scientific or scholarly, educational, ideological, or propagandistic, community-focused, and so forth. The list goes on. Even with such a robust and wide-ranging array of categories, museums that may appear to be similar often are not. For example, the 3 of the largest so-called encyclopedic museums, the British Museum, the Louvre, and the Metropolitan, they're actually all quite different. The British Museum is a national museum, but not a nationalistic museum. 8 million objects in its collection, but it isn't really about Britain, and most of the objects there are not actually British. The Louvre, which has an encyclopedic collection, is more of a nationalistic institution by virtue of the ambition to present and disclose not only the great achievements of French artists, but also their magnificent taste and the ways in which they could build an institution that would be the envy of the world. That was the aspiration from the onset. And by distinction, we might think of the Met as a more civic institution by virtue of the fact that it has a global market and audience and mission, but also a decidedly local one, and that it has a governance structure that is more unique in the United States, with an independent board and funding that is mostly philanthropic, with a modest relationship to the city government. So by virtue of those differences, even these institutions which look alike in many ways, they are not either. For each of these institutions and most others, their role has been evolving in fundamentally productive ways that have meaningfully advanced the objectives of free societies, even in such difficult times as these. Put differently, unlike the diminishing circumstances of democratic governments around the world, perhaps especially in the United States, I would argue that the museum movement, which is itself a democratizing force, has been evolving in highly productive ways, even if some of what they do is controversial and not everyone would agree with that statement. I will defend it in my remarks this evening. The fact that we have seen so many protests of various kinds within museums, and note the vast majority are not related to the specific programs or larger mission of the museum. Take, for example, the recent attack on Queen Victoria in Glasgow just on Sunday. or a few weeks ago on the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, and so forth. This is an indication of their social prominence and perceived value. Attacking the work of Leonardo da Vinci, Sandro Botticelli, Vincent van Gogh, or Francis John Williamson is intended to capture our attention because we care deeply about museums and what they contain. Museums have become compelling targets precisely because they matter to us so much. If we are to step back from the particularities of their collections, governance structures, and institutional missions to reflect on what all of these institutions have in common, we would note that they share a commitment in some manner to the public good, and like the university, they serve as an essential civic role that depends fundamentally on the collective engagement and support of the public, more specifically, the various local constituencies that are responsible for their well-being. This is not equally true for every institution. As I have said, the Louvre is different from the Met, but it is generally the case for all. By virtue of their relatively smaller size, as compared to universities, for example, their obligations of public trust, and the more specific character of their missions, museums, when they are operating as they should, play an almost uniquely integral role in our society. To understand more fully the current role that museums are asked to play, I will briefly trace the ways in which the role of the museum has evolved from the treasuries and palaces of antiquity to become the vital public institutions that they are today, with the rising expectation that they operate ethically and transparently, confront their own histories honestly, and behave with integrity and an ever-expanding commitment to public service. As we consider the challenges before us within our institutions and beyond, the museum must continue to evolve to fulfill the ethical promise and meet its larger and profoundly important societal obligations. The next steps in that process will not be easy, but they will be essential, and we are facing a new chapter. To understand the distinctive character of the museum in the world today, it would be useful to trace very briefly the development of some of these ideas going back to antiquity. And I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but it feels to me, and it always has, that understanding what museums do today really does require us to reflect on why it is that human beings have been drawn inexorably and always to connecting to the material world in ways to define their own identities, to tell stories, and to establish their relationship to others in the world. This was the case in the ancient world in various ways. We might reflect, for example, on the ways in which the collections of art served as ways of presenting power and authority by ancient societies. An obvious example of that, an interesting one, is the Stele of Naram Sin, a very famous object made for the Akkadian leader 2250 BCE named Naram Sin, who was victorious in one of his many battles over the Lullaby mountain people. And this image documents that victory. It's a very interesting work of art for many reasons, which we are not here to talk about, but I will say it's the oldest natural landscape in the history of Western art. But what I find, what's useful to us here is this object, which was made in 2250 BCE, was taken by Shutruk-Nahunt, who was the Elamite king, 1,000+ years later when he defeated the society that held this object in Sippar, 1,000 years later, and he brought it back to his own palace in Elam, and in Susa, rather, the Elamite capital in Susa. And it has an inscription on it already here, which was made by the people for Naram Sin at that time, describing the great victory. But Shutruk-Nahunt added at the base another inscription, tying himself to this great king of 1,000 years earlier and describing his own victories in language that is analogous to the victories of his predecessor. So in this instance and in others, works of art were used, plunder, booty. They were brought together in ways in collections that were being presented to audiences of various kinds in their capital in order to demonstrate their capacity to control other societies, but also at some level their interest in the world around them. Another work of art like that is the Law Code of Hammurabi, the earliest example of a law code in existence. This too is in the Louvre. This too was found in Susa when the site was excavated in 1898. Both were plundered, brought there by Shutruk-Nahunt in 1150 BCE, and where they spent 500 years on display until Ashurbanipal, the Neo-Assyrian king, came and leveled the city of Susa, and these objects were lost to the earth until they were excavated, as I said, in 1898. I point this out only to say that it's perhaps obvious that in the ancient world, works of art were brought in service of these various purposes, but they functioned in their societies and in ways that's not entirely different from how museums operate in the world today, to define their relationship to others and to tell stories. Another example in the ancient world, obvious to all of us, is the ways in which collecting or the presentation of art in the ancient world, in this example on the Parthenon, on the Acropolis in Athens from the 5th century BC, was a way of helping to define and present narratives of their own identity. The art on this monument, as many of you probably know so well, consists of metopes and friezes. The frieze that adorns the interior of the cella of this structure is over 500 feet long, and it is a presentation ostensibly of the Panathenaic procession. Every 4 years, the Athenians would march through the city to the Acropolis to present the peplos in honor of the gods. But really, it's a portrayal of the daily life of the Athenians. Every aspect of what people did and how they lived is presented in this work. So we have a combination of mythological presentation with narrative of daily life in this way, votive offerings that were placed on the steps of this temple, all in service at one level of their religious beliefs, but also ways in which they defined their identity and made a presentation to all of history about who they are and what they stood for. And there's no question that when the Acropolis, when the Parthenon was completed, those who were building it understood we'd be talking about it thousands of years later. That was the ambition. It was an intention, a way of describing their identity, as I say. The concept of the museum evolves, and I should say, by the way, let me go back for 1 second. The use of that space in this museological way was documented very early on. For example, in the 2nd century of our era, Pausanias, the great traveler, one of the great early tourists of the Greek and Roman world, he traveled many of these sites. And when he got to the Acropolis and wrote about his experience, he described exactly as we would if we were documenting our visit, what he saw and what it meant and how he reacted to it and what it told him about the people who made this object, in his case, 700 years earlier than his visit. But it wasn't categorically different than it would be for us 2 millennia later. The concept of the museum takes a more formal role in the ancient Roman world, as I mentioned a moment ago, when the Roman Republic was coming apart and the Republic was coming apart and the empire was on the rise. There was great concern about what would happen to the personal freedom of the citizens of Rome. And Gaius Asinius Pollio commissioned a monument that would be a public library and a public art display in the city of Rome, explicitly with the intention of providing access to the public to knowledge that would allow them to be informed citizens who would be able to therefore, ideally, protect the freedoms that they had worked so hard to obtain. So the first public museum, and reasonable people can argue about whether this one is it's certainly one of them, was put there for a civic purpose, to do something for the public that elevated the aspirations of a free society. We have a long interval in the Middle Ages where the museum story is not very interesting. I'm a medievalist, so I can tell you things happen, but they're not museologically interesting. At the time of the Enlightenment, something happens, of course, not just related to museums, but we see the elevation of a host of values and interests that are commensurate with the museum movement. An emerging from Renaissance humanism, but focused on the primacy of empiricism, reason over faith, individual rights and the scientific method, but above all, a commitment to the idea of progress, that we can be better tomorrow than we are today if we pursue those ambitions. This was at the center of the Enlightenment, and it was out of that quest and that ambition in the 18th century especially, that museums emerged, first in Rome, and then in Paris and in London and various places, precisely because they allowed those ambitions to be fulfilled in a more thoughtful and systematic way within the walls of a museum. Certainly in Rome, that was one ambition. The other was that all the grand tourists who were visiting Rome at the time were taking things back to places like London, and they created a museum in order to have them within the walls so they didn't leave the city anymore and damage their tourism industry. This was the papacy's plan, the Vatican's plan for the Capitoline, which is what you see here. Of course, the British Museum was founded, as all of you probably know, in the 18th century in 1753, and the Louvre in 1793. So the museum movement, as we understand it, was certainly an Enlightenment development. The concept of it as a civic institution directly connected to serving the public and advancing those ambitions was an Enlightenment concept. But the next major inflection on that idea takes place in the United States. As the the American society was finding its way, the first real impulse to create museums was in the latter part of the 19th century. And the story related especially to the Metropolitan in New York was that a series of leaders in the city of New York were on a trip to Paris, and they saw the Louvre and were inspired by the role that a great museum can play in a serious metropolis. And New York was a burgeoning metropolis with many, many things going for it, but not a cultural life of any account at the time of the Civil War in the United States in the 1850s and 60s. So they had the idea to build a museum on a scale and comparable in ambition to the Louvre. And that's where the Metropolitan began. What makes it an interesting story is that that ambition was coupled with no art and no money, just a vision that was expansive and a little bit reckless. The story that followed, the creation of the Metropolitan, is a monument to a different set of considerations, the way it's governed, how it was funded, the opportunities the economy allowed for the collecting of art, and so forth. But the original concept was a civic one. It was a democratizing one. It was tied into the notion of building out this Enlightenment value in a way that served all of the population. And from the start, even though the Metropolitan is seen today in many ways as an institution with magnificent objects, it was intended from the outset to be an educational institution in service to the public, to everyone, not just those people who collected art, but to everyone. Nonetheless, at the time, they hadn't thought it through so thoroughly that the one day of the week when working people could come, the museum was closed. That would be Sunday. So they had to sort out, how do you actually translate ambition into action? And that actually is the civic story of museums ever since. How do you connect with people? How do you bring them in? How do you provide them with experiences that elevate them, serving their interests, but also societies more generally? And that's what happened at the Met. So I'll come back to that. What we see today, therefore, is, I think, an enormously successful social experiment that we would call the museum. And it exists all over the landscape, not just in the United States or in Britain or in France, but everywhere. When I was leading the Met, for example, I was approached on a regular basis, not only by leaders in the Middle East, but especially in China, who were seeking our expertise and our resources, our art, to help them create museums in almost every city they were building and developing across China. There was a great understanding and a recognition that museums are an essential part of what makes a city function at a high level, what brings people together, what provides a civic resource that really you don't find in any other way. So we now think of museums as essential parts of a society in ways we absolutely didn't when we started creating repositories of objects that people could visit and appreciate, even during the period of the Enlightenment. As a result of all of that, museums now fulfill a variety of functions beyond just being repositories of art. They are sanctuaries that people come to for restoration and reflection, for learning and growth in ways that is profoundly important to people who do this. I was always struck during my years at the Met by the stories I would hear from people who have been visiting this institution all their lives, ever since they were children. And on the one hand, they wanted to see what was new and they appreciated greatly what's happening at the Met. They didn't want it to change too much because it's their museum and they know exactly where those paintings are that they wanted to visit, those galleries that meant so much to them. It's the same for the British Museum and the Louvre and the Fitzwilliam and every other museum. There is this tension between the need for progress and the desire for this sanctuary not to change. In the rest of our lives, so many things do change. We think of these places as very special for us because of what they offer as a sanctuary. They are sublime and peaceful and everlasting. They are also places where we can gather together and have a forum where we debate and discuss ideas. There aren't very many places in our society where that can be done for everyone. We are having just such a conversation this evening, but we're doing it within the walls of one of the great universities. And maybe this is open to the public, but it's not always obvious that people come onto universities the way they come to museums. Museums are truly open to everyone, and it is a place where ideas can live, debate can ensue. Not always easy to do, but it's essential that they provide that function. They are places for identity. collective institutional community identity. The Metropolitan looks the way it does. The British Museum looks the way it does, because we want to tell a story about who we are, what our values are, what our place in society is. And architecture and configuration of the space help us to do that. So collectively, they are absolutely hallmarks of identity, but they also are places where we come to find our own identity, that we seek within the walls of these museums, ways of understanding who we are, where we come from, who are we connected to. And it's often very interesting how we construe that. I'm not sure 100 or 200 years ago that was as visible a consideration as it is now, but I'm always struck by the ways in which people construe that for themselves. Shortly after we reopened after COVID at the Met, we were closed for 5.5 months. It was a very special day. There was a lot of attention being devoted to this. We had reopened, and there was a documentary team doing a film about the Met's experience through COVID. And they interviewed a young man, a young guy with a wild head of hair and a leather jacket, very cool looking young character. And he was standing in the Greek and Roman galleries, and they asked him, "Why are you here? What are you here to see?" And he looked at these works of Greek art and Roman art, and he said, "Because these are my people. This is where I come from. This is who I am. I'm a Roman." And I thought, he's actually from Tenafly, New Jersey, but he thought of himself that way because we all do that. We all look for ways to connect ourselves to our history, to the world around us. And for museums, this is a place where people seek identity in fundamental ways, and in ways, as I say, we didn't always anticipate. Museums are also places for community. That functions a little bit differently in the United States, where museums are genuine, they're nonprofit organizations without direct affiliations, most of them, not all. There is the Smithsonian and others, but many of them are truly independent. So they are run by, funded by, led by in every way, the local community. So these are places for community, but it's also true for museums here in the UK and elsewhere. We all come together to make these institutions work the way they do. So they provide us with a fabric for social intercourse, for ways of working together, for understanding each other, for bridging difference just to make the institution operate, meeting the needs of the institution, prosaic and otherwise. For all those reasons, then, museums have become essential civic institutions far beyond repositories of art and objects, or whatever it is that they hold. We started with that concept for sure, but they have become something so much larger. That's why there are 35,000 museums of one kind or another in the US. I haven't done a count here, but I'll bet there are a lot of them, of all kinds, even in Cambridge, dozens probably. And they serve a variety of functions because they do so much for us, more than just keep our material legacy safe and sound and available for review. As a result of all of that and the evolution of these institutions, as we've been discussing, they have become, I would say, and we're at this crossroads, the obligation to become ethical institutions in a much more visible and obvious way than they have in the past. Only 2 or 3 generations ago, museum directors were, not all of them, but many of them were primarily devoted to the ambition of treasure collecting. My predecessor at the Met, Thomas Hoving, who was there in the 1960s and 70s, published many books about his adventures in the art trade and how he found things. He often knew they were hot, as it were, or illegal, but he bought them anyway because he assumed at the time, no one really cares about that sort of thing, but isn't this a magnificent work of art? And that's what people are going to care about. Those considerations no longer obtain. We are obligated today to operate in a different way with a different set of ethical expectations. And as a result, the institutional point of view about its relationship to the world inevitably evolves. So I want to talk about the ethical museum because I think this is as we enter the new chapter, there are a variety of ways in which museums must raise the visibility and importance of what it means to be an ethical institution. If we think of ourselves as civic institutions born out of the ambitions that I've been describing, then the logical consequence of those is that museums should be paragons of civic discourse. They should embody the highest values of the society that created them, beyond just having great things to look at. And if we understand that obligation and recognize what we represent in our societies, particularly at a time when other institutions are doing it not so well, we have an obligation to do it as well as we can. And this I would call the ethical institution. Glenn Lowry, the longstanding director of the Museum of Modern Art, described museums, in particular art museums, as the preeminent civic institutions of our time. And I think there's merit in that statement. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about what does that mean? Where do we go from here? And I would observe there are, I think, as we enter this new chapter, 4 pillars of the ethical museum that must be fulfilled for us to be able to provide the kind of service and resource that we historically have and that we will need to have in the world today. The first is to fulfill our civic mission in a time of conflict and polarization. That means to keep our eye on the ball, to focus on what it is that we do across the range of activities that I've described, beyond, again, the objects we possess. It means we must be inclusive. We have to be accountable to those who have a vested interest in what we do, the public, whoever supports us. We have to be sustainable. We are perpetual institutions. Unlike most organizations and certainly businesses, our business, it is the business at Cambridge to be here a long time, and they're winning that race. But all of us are here to be perpetual institutions, to pass on the legacy of our work and our collections, our values across time, across generations, in theory, forever. I was always mindful of those issues when I was leading the Met and had to make decisions about investments. What does this mean down the road if we build that new wing? I have enough money to pay for the construction, but what are the operating costs and what will the depreciation and maintenance require in years ahead? And who's going to pay that? How do we think about that? When I arrived at the Met, this is not a Met story, I mean, it sort of is, we had a skylights problem over the European paintings galleries, several acres of skylights that were due to be replaced. I arrived in 2015. They were due to be replaced in the early 1960s, and they had not been replaced because who wants to spend $150 million on skylights? But by the time I arrived, one would not want to look above the attic level and to see how these skylights were functioning with sheets of plastic and buckets. And every time it rained, we'd have to mobilize a team of maintenance staff up there to collect the water before it overflowed the buckets. That's not responsible deferred maintenance. So we had to go ahead and do that. It is our responsibility as an ethical institution to think about the generations to come, to maintain what I would call intergenerational equity. If you can make the institution better when you've left than when you found it, and leave them with resources so that they can do the same, then you perpetuate the organizational idea that will allow it, at least in theory, to live forever. If you don't, and you pursue an individual ambition to create something that's exciting and fun and is going to be in the paper tomorrow, and it isn't properly funded, you burden the future generations in various ways. So how does one be a civic institution in an age of polarization? One, it is to focus on governance. Good governance is at the center of what any civic institution has to do right. If one wants to observe the dissolution of American democracy, just look at the way in which the civic entities, the governmental entities, work with each other. They don't know how to. There has to be a way for shared governance to function in every institution of any size. That means understanding the role of the board. If it's an independent organization like the Metropolitan, for example, it is a self-perpetuating board of trustees that have fiduciary responsibility for the institution. They hire and fire the leader, and they have other obligations. If it's a board for a governmentally funded institution, as say the British Museum, they have slightly different obligations. The answer isn't that one model or the other works best. It's understanding the structure you have and figuring out how to harness the value and the strength of shared governance, whatever you've got. Because if you don't do that, you will not make good decisions that are responsive to the needs of your society. Inevitably, better decisions can be made through collective discussion, as long as it's done efficiently and responsibly, but it's key. Any mission-driven institution, not just a museum, but any mission-driven institution requires shared governance to operate well. There is the question of funding. If you are to be a high-functioning ethical institution with a civic ambition, who's going to pay for it? Again, there are a variety of models, all of which can work. The key isn't finding the ideal solution that works for everyone. It's understanding that the ambition of finding the right level of funding, the right mechanism for funding, allows you to sustain independence, resilience or resistance to the overt burning or the undue influence of anyone in particular. One doesn't want to have an owner when you run an art museum or a university, where what you do is governed by what a particular individual or group would like you to do. So maintaining a funding level that allows for independence, resilience, ideally a certain amount of robustness that you can respond to challenges in the economy. If there's a downturn in one area of the economy and you have sources of funding that complement that, it doesn't put you out of business, for example. All of those are considerations. In any organization that deals with philanthropic support, and all of them do at some level, then there's the question of whose money should we take? Do we undermine our mission? Do we diminish our approach to the work that we're supposed to do if we take money from that creep or that criminal? And the answer is sometimes yes, and sometimes no. So how do we sort that out? Should the British Museum be taking money from British Petroleum? That's a discussion in the media on a regular basis. And their answer is, it doesn't relate directly to the work that we do, and we cannot deliver the mission and the programs that we deliver for the public good without such a sponsor. Reasonable answer. I don't know the answer for them. Should the name Sackler should be on galleries around the world, as it was recently and now isn't? How does one sort that out? There are many, many such instances. The answer there too is dependent on what I would call shared governance. First, you have to figure out what the values of the institution are. We have to acknowledge that every institution has limits as to who they would take money from. They always do. The question is, where do you draw the line and why? And what process are you undertaking to make that decision in a way that's consistent with the institution's values and courageous enough to be transparent? Because if it's not transparent, then the speculation about what you're doing will erode trust. And without trust, museums cannot function any more than universities can. So having a funding model that is responsive to those considerations, whatever the sources of it are, requires self-consciousness on the part of the leadership about that issue and clarity about what their ambitions are. Related to the civic mission is the idea of sustainability. As I said earlier, we have an ethical obligation to run these institutions in a way that benefits future generations as much as it does the world today. And anything else is irresponsible. And it's not that easy to get right because it's hard to know. I recently was in discussions with a donor about the possibility of a major gift for a new wing at the Metropolitan. And the donor wanted to know, I'd like to be able to make sure that this wing is maintained perfectly till the end of time. So, okay, well, we can do, I can tell you what steel prices are now, but they wanted a more rigorous consideration of that. And they engaged a professional engineer and architect to help us figure out, this sounds sort of amusing, but how much money do I have to give you now so that the building will be it will be beautiful in 200 years? Well, we'll need to replace the air conditioning system in about 60 years. We'll have to replace the cladding on the building in about 80 years. And what will the cost of an air conditioning system be in 60 years? They calculated that. So a gift of $25 million today, properly invested, would accrue the billions and billions of dollars needed in perpetuity to maintain the building at a level that was satisfactory to the donor, so the building would look as good in the future always as it does today. Alas, not every donor is that interested in perpetuity, but the obligation is to reflect on sustainability at some level, and how do you make sure you're protecting future generations? And then finally, the last element of what it means to be civic in the age of an ethical institution is to find ways in a continuous basis to engage the public, to make sure you're telling your story in ways that is elevated and responsible, but engaged and connected. And it's easy to get tired of that because we all know that the more we talk to everybody about what we're doing, they have all these opinions, and before you know it, it's hard to get anything done. That's a mistake. So the first of these pillars is to be a civic institution in the age that we live in today and in the future. The second is to advance knowledge through a commitment to scholarship, education, and expertise. That's always been the mission of a university or a museum that does research. But it's very hard to sustain that in a time of hype and anti-intellectualism. We all feel the pressure to pander. We all worry about the ways in which we might not be able to sustain that criticism for that difficult exhibition or that problematic book or that unpopular lecture that we're commissioning. First of all, we have to distinguish between education and entertainment. and be very clear as to what the difference is without sounding pedantic or pompous. We are an educational institution. The difference is, in a nutshell, that entertainment enlivens and inspires us in ways to have a good time, but it more or less leaves us where we are. Education, when it works well, takes us somewhere new and helps us understand the joy of progress and what it means to see things in a new way. Almost always, education requires us to be a little bit uncomfortable. One could never imagine a course being taught at Cambridge University where the first thing the faculty member says is, not to worry, I'm not going to talk about anything that makes you uncomfortable. We're not going to share any information with you that you don't already know. That's idiocy. But that is the kind of pressure that institutions often face when they present materials in ways that is controversial. So the question isn't whether we should do it, but how to do it well and how to defend ourselves when the criticisms come, and they will surely come. So there are various things to say about that. First of all, in order to do this well, we have to make sure that we constantly distinguish between criticism for an idea and criticism for a person. We all know that canceling is at some level a problem, but it isn't a new problem. Socrates was canceled, literally canceled. Spinoza was canceled. He was excommunicated from everything that he loved, everything, in order to pursue his ambition, to pursue knowledge in the ways he understood it to be. We see examples of it in the society today. How do we make sure we're protecting the people and allowing the ideas to live or die on their own in a forum of debate and discussion that is rigorous and thoughtful? We all believe in the value of competitive juxtaposition of ideas. That's how science works. Why shouldn't it be how the humanities work too? We also need to distinguish between evidence-based argument and feelings. Feelings have a place in our society, there's no question. And when you're dealing with a creative act, feelings are at the center of what it means to be a creative person. But when you're arguing or debating over evidence-based material, feelings have no place. There has to be a place for evidence-based inquiry. I think that's an essential point. And I would just point out what Anthony Croneman, the legal scholar, has argued. To assign a normative weight to private sensations and beliefs in a way that insulates them from public scrutiny destroys the possibility of Socratic inquiry. This makes the public sphere of reason hostage to the private realm of feeling. So our job is to get the ideas out there, let them live, have them get debated, and protect the people who are presenting them. So I'd like to mention briefly two examples of recent exhibitions that took on difficult issues with varying levels of success. The first is the exhibition in the work of art was called Why Born a Slave by Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux. The work was produced in 1873. It was an exhibition, a small exhibition at the Met with a big idea. This was, in my view, a thoughtful and responsible presentation of a difficult topic. The exhibition, curated by Elise Nelson at the Met in 2021, explored the complex and contradictory meaning of this sculptural masterwork by Carpeaux. As we see, the sculpture portrays an enslaved woman with a defiant gaze and exposed breast, straining against the ropes that bind her. Nelson argued that Carpeaux has created an empathetic image of the brutality of slavery, but also, quote, of aestheticized violence, the transformation of human carnage into erotically charged drama, unquote. Adducing considerable evidence from the time, Nelson and her colleagues demonstrated that the work was at once poignant and powerful as an expression of human suffering wrought by slavery, while also presenting an objectified image of violence against women. The exhibition presented its case carefully and with substantial historical materials to back it up, but it also had available in the exhibition a wall for comment and discussion by anyone who came and wished to make comment. There was a curator assigned to the task of reading all of those comments, posting a representative example of them, and interpreting them in ways that informed the exhibition so that the curators in the museum could learn, the public could learn, and we could have a responsible and thoughtful discussion about a difficult issue in a public way without conceding the importance of expertise and knowledge to produce this work in the first place. By contrast, we might talk about this work of art. This is called Scaffold by Sam Durant. It was first created in 2012. This work of art was a large constructed installation designed to resemble or evoke the gallows used for a series of public executions that was very briefly installed in the sculpture garden at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. The piece was intended to reference in a very direct manner 7 public executions undertaken by the US government between the years 1859 and 2006. It was a critique against state-sponsored violence. That was the theory behind this object. Most important, this work referenced the largest public execution in American history, which consisted of the hanging of 38 men from the Dakota Native American tribe in 1862 in the city of Mankato, which was located 80 miles from where this was placed, in a community that has the largest population of Native Americans in the US, except for, I think, New York. Along the way, as the planning for this project was undertaken, the work was purchased in 2014, and it was installed in 2017. There wasn't a single conversation or engagement or outreach to the Native American communities around it. Just one day, this thing showed up, as you see it here, in the sculpture garden. Immediately, it generated enormous criticism and concern, not only from the Native American communities, but from many other people as well. What was it doing here? What was the reason for it? What's the underlying idea? It went on, it created, and probably many of you are familiar with the controversy as it played out in the media. In my view, the question wasn't whether a scaffold should have been, I should say, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. 5 days later, they took it down. So it was presented. The members of the community were outraged. They reached out in various ways. There was protesting of varying kinds, more robust protesting than that, but that's my slide. And instantly, the leaders of the museum and the artists met with Native American leaders in the community, and they apologized and said, we're taking it down. They took it down. They negotiated what to do with the pieces. They were given to the Native community, and it was buried. And the rights to the sculpture were also conveyed to the Native community. So the question for me isn't whether it should have been taken down. I believe it should have been taken down. The question is why it was put up in the first place. What was actually the motivating impulse here to do this? What was the idea behind this? Where was the consultation and the process for this? I was struck both by how ghastly this object is, and to have it, I mean, imagine, just to give you a ghastly comparison, placing a great, it was also, by the way, intended for people to play on and climb on, if children could use it as a jungle gym. That was part of the concept in the sculpture park. Imagine placing a great big gas chamber in the middle of the Warsaw Ghetto without talking to anyone. I mean, it's unimaginable. That's what it meant to the Native communities who saw this thing, this mechanism for the execution of 38 of their own citizens. Okay, that's one side of the issue. The other side is if there's an idea there, present it, share it, defend it. There wasn't any. So in the end, the debacle of the scaffold helped us to understand the cost and consequences of poor planning and taking not a rigorous approach to your work, but a glib one. And I think ultimately, certainly there was a lot of suffering across the board. They did the right thing when they were confronted. There was great damage, certainly to the museum director and to the others on staff and to the artist, but much greater damage to the public who suffered from this, and even more important, the levels of trust that the public place in institutions like the Walker Art Center to do work that is responsible and edifying and challenging and inspiring. They failed in all of those measures. So there is a way to do difficult work, to be a forum for ideas, but it requires effort, it requires expertise and seriousness of purpose, and also courage. One has to defend those ideas at the right moment. So we're moving from the profoundly unpleasant to the ridiculous. The third pillar of the ethical museum is to pursue the concept of universalism, which I would distinguish from encyclopedism. The difference being that universalist museums are aspirational to build connections. They understand the limitations of their collections and their knowledge. They seek connections across difference. They seek to learn from each other. The concept of encyclopedism it's not exactly pejorative, but it presumes a certain comprehensiveness and authority that museums can't really rightly possess any more than universities can. So it's a state of mind more than anything else. And at the center of the issue of universalism is a responsible approach to cultural property. This is one of the most important issues that the ethical museum must face and that our society is confronted with as we reflect on the consequences of colonialism and so forth. I think there are three elements to the conversation about cultural property that we must keep in mind. The first is to engage in ethical collecting with rigorous oversight. This requires clear guidelines, proper due diligence, and greater transparency. There needs to be a substantive process. If you're going to be in the business of acquiring art, particularly from ancient or historical societies, one needs to understand where these things come from and whether you have the right to own them. By way of a colorful example, this happened on my watch. The Metropolitan acquired this late Ptolemaic magnificent gold coffin on the right. And the ambition was, we had nothing like this. We were very excited about this. We went through the due diligence that you're supposed to go through. There were lots of documents, pages and pages of them. And we thought, this looks good. We will make this acquisition. It was a $4 million purchase. We were very proud of that. And then Kim Kardashian entered the scene. And in this photograph at the Met Gala, which was broadcast all over the world, shortly after this was broadcast, it was brought to our attention that this object was looted. So we reviewed the materials. We were disappointed, but we were never for an instant unwilling to engage the problem. And we discovered that the materials that we had been given had been forged. And it was the New York District Attorney who had a team of people investigating this, who demonstrated why we should have found it ourselves. There's no question. As a result of that, we had to raise the bar in order to be more responsible and more thoughtful about making acquisitions. This object was restituted as it should be to the Egyptian government, to the Egyptian people, and we learned from our experience. But the first phase of being an ethical institution is not to become so seduced by the opportunity to acquire the object that you in any way fall away from the highest possible standards of review and due diligence. The second is to protect cultural heritage where it is in the ground, wherever in the world. Museums can't do that much about it, but they can be thoughtful and powerful advocates for cultural preservation. They can help to shape government policy. When Donald Trump made the decision glibly that we would not support UNESCO and maybe we should be bombing cultural heritage sites in Iraq and other places that irritate us, I spoke out right away. That wasn't difficult, that was also idiocy. That is not an enlightened policy to be taking about cultural heritage. There are things museums can do, as like universities and others, to advocate for better policies and to support people on the ground where they are doing the work. At the Met, we did this in great quantities, sending materials and resources to curators in Syria, in Iraq, and other places that were trying to save or at least document their collections. The third area is cultural restitution. This is perhaps the most problematic. What do we do about all the stuff we already have? How do we think about these collections and what is the right thing to do? There are, to be sure, a variety of criteria we need to keep in mind to help make that decision, and we need to be systematic about that, as we haven't been. We have not been, as a society, systematic about these questions. But for example, we need to consider the time frame for which the objects came into our possession. If it was hundreds of years ago, does that matter? Well, one would argue it matters for the Elgin marbles. That's still a live debate and discussion. But the Elgin marbles were acquired at exactly the same time Napoleon was plundering Europe. And hundreds of works of art that Napoleon plundered and then was able to maintain through conquest and coercive treaties remain at the Louvre. And no one really is concerned about that. They're just there. But that's how they got there. So it isn't always simple enough to say that this happened a long time ago, so let's move on. There are real and live reasons why there are discussions around the Elgin marbles or the Benin bronzes or other works of art that have to be addressed. So that's one set of considerations. But there are others. For example, the legal considerations that may seem more straightforward, but laws change over time and generations of legal changes. Which laws are we reflecting upon? The ones that obtained when the work of art was acquired 100 years ago, or the ones 50 years ago, or 25 years ago, or today? We need to make sure we protect all of the parties that are involved in this, not just the ones on the front lines or getting the most attention. The Benin bronzes, for example, we can get into a discussion about the Benin bronzes if you wish during the discussion period, but those works of art are now in 156 museums around the world, and there are lots of people who own them who acquired them, as it were, legally. So what is to be done about unwinding all of those records and histories in ways that is responsible? Finally, there is the question of the well-being of the object itself. Do we restitute a work of art to a place where it will be stolen or damaged or maybe assaulted in a war? Probably not. Who's to make that decision? And is that the right of the person possessing that object to do that? All of this to say is there are no easy answers, but the questions need to be confronted with clear criteria and a willingness to discuss them and not just avoid debate or discussion with the media because the problem is going to go away. It isn't going to go away. There needs to be a better way forward. One example of a way forward, I'll do this quickly. The Metropolitan was approached by a donor who had the largest collection of Cycladic art in private hands in the world. He had built that collection in a responsible way over the course of decades, but the laws on the books now prohibited us from taking that gift at the Met because the provenance wasn't strong enough for us to take them and know that it was the right thing to do. So through discussion and negotiation, the donor agreed to make a gift to the Greek people of all of these things, and then the Greek government would loan them to us effectively indefinitely. The title is clear. These are not the property of the Metropolitan, though they are on display there, and they will be for the rest of our lifetimes, if not longer. Sorting out who owns something is different from what happens to it and how it is cared for. The future of the Ethical Museum will involve fewer arguments about title and more discussion about partnership and collaboration. The world benefits in having works of art move around a little bit if they can safely be moved around a little bit. So there are all kinds of creative solutions that might allow for that to happen if we get off the consideration of just worrying about title and who possesses it. So finally, the last of my pillars, and then I will stop, is that we must focus on progress. And that may seem like a banal or obvious thing to say, but it isn't, I don't think. What does it actually mean to be an institution that protects history, that is here for the duration, focused on perpetuity with the legacies that we have, that actually lives in the world today as well? There are activists who would have the museum dismantle many of its collections. I have had creative suggestions from activists during my years at the Met that maybe I should quit, I should fire the board, and we should give everything away and start all over. And I wrote back and said, I think that's an excellent idea, but actually what you're proposing is a new museum. Why don't you just go build one and leave us alone? The question is, how do we live in the world and do all of those things? What rules should we use? I would argue there is a difference between taking positions on issues that we're not qualified to take. We are often asked to take positions in universities, university leaders or museum leaders, on issues in which we bring no special expertise. I don't know any more about the issue of climate control or gun control than you do. It isn't our expertise, but we should be advocates for things that concern our mission. When Donald Trump wants to assail the cultural property of the world, it is our obligation to fight that. When somebody wants to make a suggestion or a change to what museums do, we have an obligation to engage there. So there's a difference between taking positions and engaging them responsibly. Museums, like universities, need to engage them responsibly and provide a forum for learning to take place, for growth and value to come out of that process, not simply to use the platform we have to express the opinions that we have for whatever reason. So engaging them responsibly requires us, as I say, we have to think about the framework. The framework for museums is long, it's not quick. We need to think about representation. We represent everyone, not just the people who are shouting at us, not just the people who are writing nasty things about us in the newspapers, but actually everyone. We have an obligation to all of those constituencies. And we need to keep our mission in mind. What are we here to do as an art museum? And how is that distinctive in our society? And keep that in mind. So how do we do that? I think there are a series of questions I go through whenever I was confronted with those issues. First, how can we add knowledge and understanding to this issue? What do we know? What do we bring? Why us? Second, what are the long-term consequences of that decision? What's going to happen to the museum, not just now, we'll get good press next week, what's going to happen in the years ahead if we make that decision? What was the process behind the decision? Who did we listen to? Who did we engage? The creative act of shared governance is at every turn to think about who needs to contribute to this discussion. It's not everybody all the time, but it's a lot of people some of the time, and figuring out who they are and doing that in an expeditious way. What's the rationale, and are we going to present that? There was no rationale for scaffold. It was just up and then it was down. And is there a place for differing views? How do we make sure that if our view isn't widely agreed upon, is there a way in which others can express their views if that's useful or important? So for all those reasons, I think the Ethical Museum has to be the next chapter of what it is we do. If we reflect on where we've come from, our long history, our remarkable success, but we have evolved to play a role in our society that far transcends being repositories for material culture. We play a role in our society that is arguably unique, and therefore we have arguably distinctive ethical obligations to move forward. As I think about the future, therefore, I think collaboration will be a much more important part of what museums do. Every good museum will have a constellation of agreements and partnerships with other institutions and governments and people all over the world. Think of us as interconnected networks where even the issues of ownership are no longer so clear or discrete. We have to engage the people that come to us without cynicism, in the hope and expectation we can do something meaningful in how people think about the world. We are, after all, that is our business. We have to maintain as much independence from outside influence as we can, however we're structured, whoever effectively funds us. Find a way to be as independent as you can, because collectively you do better work when no one owns you. We have to remain accountable, even when it's unpleasant. It wasn't fun to do press conferences about the gold coffin of Nejamonk before the media and the public, but we had an obligation to do that. And throughout all of that work, we need to be more visible than we have in the past about our values. Why are we making the decisions we are? If we can be clear about our rationale, clear about our values, and present those to the community around us, we will learn from the discussion that ensues. I am confident that will happen. Raise the bar in the kind of discourse we seek, and people will rise to the occasion. What we see very often is the exact opposite. And I think museums are at a scale and at a level of public love and care that we can do that as a kind of hothouse experimental place for what it means to be a civic organization functioning at the very highest levels. So I'll conclude by saying these are difficult times. We have challenges before us of all kinds, and museums cannot solve them. But I am confident that if we do what we should and think about these issues as we must, we will create a better future for all of us as a result. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was a really spectacular lecture. So we're going to let you recover for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll regroup, and Robert Anderson and Daniel will have a conversation with us for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll throw it open to the floor. So we'll see you in 10 minutes. There we are, everybody. Let's reconvene for our discussions, and thank you again, Daniel, so very much for an incredibly exciting, provoking talk. So, Robert Anderson will now join our speaker in conversation. Robert's an Oxford man through and through, an honorary fellow of his old college, St. John's. He's a chemist and an historian of science. He commenced his museum life at the Science Museum in South Kensington, rising to the keepership, if that's a word, of the Department of Chemistry. In 1984, he was appointed director of the Royal Scottish Museum in Edinburgh, becoming director of the National Museums of Scotland just a year later, reporting to the Marquis of Bute, descended from one of the greatest architectural patrons there's ever been. And in 1992, he was appointed director of the British Museum, at which he served for the next 10 years, steering through the spectacular Queen Elizabeth II Great Court to completion. He finished his term with a flourish, delivering a lecture called The British Museum and World Culture in the Great People's Study House in Pyongyang, North Korea, a very rare claim to be able to boast about. And most recently, he was president and CEO of the Chemical Heritage Foundation in Philadelphia, and subsequently the Science History Institute. We will also, I hope very much, have the opportunity to take questions from the audience. So when we get to that point in about 20 minutes, two colleagues will pass the microphone around the audience in the old-fashioned way. So please do introduce yourself and tell us briefly who you are before you ask your question. Gentlemen.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan. First of all, I would like to thank Daniel for a very stimulating presentation, which covered, I think, practically every point you could possibly think of when it comes to museums. There was a great deal in it, and I think we need to perhaps slow down a bit, Dan, and think about particular issues. I've read this is the book, incidentally, which I think is most relevant, which Daniel has written, Why the Museum Matters. There are other books of that sort of nature. My predecessor, David Wilson, wrote one called The British Museum, Purpose and Politics. And there's someone called Thomas Hoving, I think, who wrote a sort of autobiography of how he was the same thing as the Metropolitan Museum. But I find yours the most insightful and most challenging of the books I've read on this subject. So congratulations. I do recommend to people who are interested in the subject to get hold of it, Yale University Press. I want to examine three areas before we open the floor to discussion. And I hope there really is discussion from the floor, because it's important that if you've got a strong point to make, that you get an opportunity to make it. So it's up to Alan to let us know when that moment comes in the proceedings, when you can make the points you want to, ask questions or whatever. I want to think perhaps about three particular issues on the nature and purpose of museums, access to them, and the management of them. And each of these three subjects actually can cover quite a number of issues which Dan brought up. I want to talk a little bit about the nature of museums in relation to the European ones, in relation to American ones, because there is a difference. I think anyone who's traveled throughout Europe and the United States will know that they do have a different flavor, one from the other. It's partly history, but it may be other things as well. Of course, European museums were started considerably earlier than those in the United States. The British Museum is said to be the first national museum, 1753. What I find interesting is, and I've just mentioned this to Dan before this meeting, before we talked this afternoon, is that so many big American museums, civic museums, use the word art in their title. This is not the case in Europe, if you think about it. In London, there's the British Museum, the Victorian Art Museum, Tate, not a word of art. In Berlin, there's the Altes Museum and the Neues Museum. In Paris, there's the Louvre. I've got a feeling, and that one reason that art is due so much is to do with perhaps sponsorship by those who are wealthy and have collections, and want to make a point that what they're doing, what they're giving to the museum, brings them status which art is associated with the materials they have. Do you agree with that or not?
I'm not sure it's a philanthropic question. I think those who wish to have their names on things, put their names on things, either inside the museums or the Frick, the Morgan Library. That if you're really interested in naming a thing, you could name a thing. I think it's an interesting question as to why American museums carry the name art. I don't think it's related to philanthropy. I think it's related to the nature of these enterprises, and perhaps there's a difference linguistically between American English and British English. We know there's a difference. But that there's just a certain level of clarity for societies that aren't so used to these kinds of institutions. Even the National Gallery of Art in Washington is not just the National Gallery. That's not sufficient. But I'm not sure that it's related to the funding mechanism.
I've always felt that one extremely lucky thing from the point of view of the British Museum is that it gave its paintings away in the 1820s to found the National Gallery. And so it could concentrate on what I think the true purpose of the British Museum, and indeed many other museums in Europe, is not art so much as history. I see, in fact, collections of objects in museums in much the same way as I'd see a collection of manuscripts or books in a library, except they're three-dimensional, but they're essential for conducting research, for example. And I think if you look at the sort of output of our museums, and certainly in the publications we produce, you can see that, in fact, scholars who use museums are in fact interested in their historical associations rather than in their aesthetical ones. Would you feel that's true?
It could very well be true. I'm reflecting on the differences between American institutions more generally and European institutions. And I think, in my own view, is it has more to do with the nature of what people expect these institutions to be and represent in their societies. And that comes out of the very significant differences in how they're funded and governed and led. Therefore, there's a connectivity to the community that is different from what we would find here. I think that's very meaningful, and it has played out in different ways, such that when I compare notes with the leaders of the British Museum or the Louvre or other institutions comparable, we have very different jobs in terms of what we do and how we think about our work.
Do you feel there's a fundamental difference between your museum and the museums which constitute the Smithsonian? Because the Smithsonian is the only really publicly funded, federally funded anyway, museum in the United States, whereas practically every other museum depends on other sources of funding.
Well, in some ways we do. The Smithsonian has a mission more closely allied, say, to the British Museum. It is completely free. It's open access, as the Metropolitan isn't, for example. But the scholarly ambition of the Smithsonian is very substantial. It consists of 17 institutions, I think, and very, very significant research facilities. The difference mainly is, again, related to the sources of funding. That if you're at the Smithsonian, you're just always thinking about the implications of what you're doing to the Senate Finance Committee, because they're the ones who are going to be approving your budgets. And we have seen evidence of that at the National Gallery in Washington, where there has been consideration. It's a wonderful institution. It does great work. But there is always regardless of what people ever say, and I think you know this, you always have to think about the sources of funding. And however courageous or independent you may want to be in that role, you need to pay your staff. You need to feed the institution. And therefore, we have to be mindful. So if the structure allows for independence in the first place, it liberates us to be more creative than if it doesn't. And so I do think there's a difference between the Smithsonian on the one hand in the US and other institutions that are not tied to government funding in quite the same way.
I'd like, since you prompted this, to perhaps talk a bit about governments through boards of trustees. I worked for 4 years quite recently in an American institution whose board was fundamentally different from any board of trustees I'd experienced in this country. And the difference was that those trustees were expected to make significant contributions to the cost of running the institution. In the British Museum, although one or two were able to do that, the bulk of the 25 trustees, there are 25, could not and would not and weren't expected to provide funding, but were expected more to provide oversight expertise, I suppose, without interfering too much with the directorial position, but nevertheless talking about things such as archaeology, art history, ethnography, and other issues. Now, does that happen or not in the Metropolitan Museum?
Well, the answer I'll provide is true for the Metropolitan as much as it is for any. Organizations that are funded primarily through philanthropy tend to lean more heavily on creating opportunities for trustees with resources. That is an endemic issue. The challenge is to, once again, as I said earlier, whatever your governance system is, to do your very best to maintain independence. So paradoxically, you're better off having 15 billionaires on your board than 2. Because if you have 15, they cancel each other out and nobody owns the board. But if you only have 1 or 2, they do own the board. So I think it's understanding the environment you're in and trying to figure out the right balance. The risk, though, to the American system is, and I think we have made collectively great progress on this front, if one looks at who are the trustees of most of these institutions, a great many of them are not particularly wealthy. There are some who are, and again, one wants balance. If one's seeking diversity in all of the ways one would seek diversity, it must include people with professional points of view and socioeconomic experiences that are not all in the billionaire category. And so the Metropolitan, half their trustees are not necessarily in that category. But one has to be very careful about curating the selection of these people to create a community that can provide good governance. The worst situation is when you have a board of people who all have modest means with one very, very wealthy donor on the board. That's ownership.
I mean, I see, remember that in America, the American institution I worked with, Science History Institute, 9/10 of the discussion on the board was about finance and how we can increase it and what we're going to use it for. The board I worked, the two main boards I worked for in this country, the National Museums of Scotland and the British Museum, their discussion was very much more about what we're using the money for and exhibitions we're going to put on and what sort of acquisitions we should make and so forth. They took an interest from that point of view. And of course, there's a danger in that. There's a danger that they interfere too much with the process. But I must say, it was very nicely balanced at the British Museum. And the trustees, some of whom were highly expert in the subjects which they were involved in outside the museum, they did actually make a very positive contribution in a way in which I didn't notice in Philadelphia. I don't think, I had that feeling that in fact the board was there, not under sufferance, but they were there simply because they felt it was their duty to be there, and they weren't taking a huge interest in what it was that they were there for.
Well, I would argue that that's a failure of shared governance. That one needs to start by understanding and appreciating what is the nature of the board. If it is a fiduciary board, as nonprofit organizations require, these people hold in trust the institution, its financial health, the decisions that are made. There is an art to getting that balance right. And it means your job as trustees, say at the Metropolitan, is to make sure that management is balancing the budget, to provide help and support and advice, but not to manage the budget. That isn't their job. Nor is it their job to make judgments about program. I think the risk that you're describing is, I would not want trustees telling our curators what they should be doing from an exhibition point of view or an acquisition point of view. It's making sure you're drawing on the expertise appropriately, but making clear what the boundaries are so that shared governance can work well. We have a job, they have a job. When it works well, there's synergy.
I didn't want to imply that in fact trustees were telling, as the word you used, staff what to do, but that they took an interest in the subjects which were being dealt with. But let's get on to something else because time is short. The question of access. You talked quite a lot about the financial problems of your museum when you entered it and how you could deal with that by applying admission charges. As you probably know, the British Museum fought very strongly against admission charges in the 1990s. They were being promoted by both the Conservative and then Blair's government. They wanted us to charge, and the trustees, I'm pleased to say, refused. What happens, of course, when you start applying a charge when previously been free is that numbers coming to the museum decline very rapidly. And what was interesting in the British case is that when the Treasury did find the money to fully fund national museums and admission charges were removed, then the numbers actually increased again. And I've got a feeling, you know, that quite a number of people were being kept out of the museum because they couldn't find the money which was needed. I'm very much aware of two important users of museums at the beginning of the 20th century. One was George Bernard Shaw, who came to the museum very frequently. He said, I think rather ironically, he came to use the lavatorial provision. And the other was Henry Moore, a bit later. Henry Moore, as you probably know, was hugely influenced by the Egyptian collection, especially the Egyptian sculptures, and also by the ethnographic collection. And if he was very poor in London, if he'd had to pay, I don't think he'd have been able to gain access. And the whole, I suppose, the whole history of his artistic development would have changed. And I would feel very unhappy if I felt that some people who had that potential were being kept out of our museums.
Well, you asked the right question. So I think it's a fundamental issue. I think the British Museum has assiduously remained committed to its vision of being completely accessible. And I have to confess, when I'm in London, I'll go into the British Museum for 15 minutes. I may do it several times in a day, which would be more difficult if I had to pay. The question, the fundamental question is, what's the right model for the institution you have before you? When I arrived at the Met, we had this very substantial operating deficit, and I had an obligation to look at all of the different revenue sources the institution uses to carry out its work. And one of them is the admissions program. And at that time, the policy was pay as you wish. You can pay a penny, you can pay $25, whatever you want, but everyone has to pay something. And it was a social experiment. We looked at the last 10 years prior to my arrival, and what we discovered is that the average amount people were paying had declined by 67% in real terms. So the social experiment was failing, and we had a deficit. So the question then is, what do we do about that? There are two options. There is finding alternative sources of revenue in order to balance the books, or reducing your program, cutting back what it is that you can do to make your expenses lower. We certainly had to do the latter because that's the responsibility everyone has. You have to balance your budget as best you can. But we think of the Metropolitan as a world-class research institution. And therefore, we have investments. Most of them are things people don't see. One of the largest art conservation facilities in the world, one of the largest libraries, lots of things that cost very significant money, that public programs. The Met does 35,000 to 40,000 public programs a year. And these things are expensive. So the question is, do we want to reduce the program, or do we want to try to find other money? So it begged the question that I often asked when I was asked this question. Okay, I have an idea. Let's be free. So who should pay? Where are we going to get the money? Because we have all of these costs. Who's going to pay? The government isn't paying for the Metropolitan. So should I call Mike Bloomberg and ask him maybe if he would endow that? And then he would, I'm making his name. We all know who he is. He's a major philanthropist. But would we go to a particular donor to solve that problem? Would we lose the balance of funding that I'm talking about that gives us independence? My argument is, for an institution that's held in the public trust, that is collectively owned by everyone, that is in service to these interests we've discussed this evening, the answer is everyone should pay at a level they can afford. So the solution we came up with actually did not reduce attendance at all, zero. There was no negative impact. When we put the policy in place, we changed was, instead of pay as you wish for everyone, it remained pay as you wish for New Yorkers, because we did get money from New York to subsidize. About 8.5% of our budget came from New York. So through their taxes, they were already paying, but everyone else had to pay some admission set by whether they're full admission or students and so forth. But we also had a policy never to turn anyone away who could not afford it. And we did that. But in any case, as an experiment, there was no zero reduction in attendance to the museum as a result of that. And I'm sure there were real consequences of people who didn't come up the stairs and show up. But we tried to minimize that. But what we looked for was a balanced, equitable, responsible exercise in shared governance. Pay something, participate in the work of this institution, which you so cherish. The alternative would have been to change the nature of our mission and to do less than we did. And that wasn't part of, in my view, our responsible solution if we could find a different one. It was not a popular decision, I'll grant you. And I would be very happy for the Met to be free for all. but it is a funding question in the end and an equity question.
Did you, at that time, and I'm sure you did, look at the cost of staffing and who the staff were you were paying? Because I suspect,
Yes.
I know that in fact, in British museums, that the, shall we say, the specialists have declined proportionally to the total number of people working in museums, and there are now all sorts of people who do things which are, which I suppose are ideally should be done, but are not necessary in the same sort of way.
I think every leader has an obligation in particularly in a charitable organization to make sure that they are fulfilling their mission with as cost-effective an approach as they can. That's a performance standard for any leader. When I arrived at the Met, there were challenges, and we made very substantial reductions in staff on the order of 15 to 20%. That across the board in various places, we structured the entire institution. Which, by the way, is not a terribly bad thing to do every 10 or 15 years in every institution. You just clean things up, and it's not a bad idea. It's painful, but we did that. I was confident at the end of that process that we had the right budget for the mission we were expected to deliver. Now we had a funding shortfall. The last recourse is to raising admissions fees and doing the things we did, but it isn't responsible to avoid that decision either. And for us, in the constellation of issues that we face as the institution that the Met is, I think it was the right thing to do, to levy the pricing change that we did.
Another thing which I've noticed as far as, and this is another point, which has been happening in museums, is that, shall we say, a system of pseudo-democratization has taken place when you can't do anything, move a yard, without there being a meeting and having to take a democratic decision about that. And I suspect that there's a similar problem in universities now, although I don't know anything about them, of course. But it does seem to me that it perhaps stifles initiative to have to explain and make a case. And if you look at the way in which curators have worked in the British Museum over the years, you find that there's some rather eccentric things happen for the time. But over time, it seems that the person involved, or some of the people involved, have done just the right thing and have collected, for example, in areas where perhaps a democratic system of decision-making would not have come to that conclusion.
Well, the democratic decision-making process is related to issues of governance of the institution administratively and policy decisions. One should never have a shared governance process as to what the scholarly agenda should be for a particular curator or site. You would never do that. That's bad governance. But I disagree with the idea that there's no question that institutions are increasingly bureaucratic and there are more meetings than anyone would like to have. But I'm a believer that the art of effective leadership of institutions that are mission-driven is harnessing shared governance in a productive way, getting it right. When I got to the Met, I had this massive deficit, not an environmental problem. It was self-imposed. It was management practices. I could not solve that problem without asking the staff to help me. And I could not ask the staff to help me without inviting them into the problem. I had to share that information with them. So we created various working groups, and I said to them, we have no choice but to make these decisions. I'd rather make them with your help, but in order to do that, we're going to set up this group, and it will be representative for all of you. We're going to meet every week, and we're going to make that decision in 6 weeks. That's the system we have to operate in. And if you want to help, step into that. And they absolutely did, because I think what most people find when the scale works and they have an opportunity to participate meaningfully in the governance of an institution they care about, they will go a very long way to help make it work because they appreciate the chance to be heard. And so I think the challenge is manage the process as best you can, but don't ignore the audience or don't ignore the community that can help you make better decisions. When I had to close the Met because of COVID, that was not a decision that had a lot of process. I made that decision by myself. I called the board and I said, I think we have a health risk to our staff and to the public. And we need to close tomorrow. And I said, and it could be as many as like 4 or 5 days or a week we're going to be closed. We were closed for 5.5 months. So you have to know when to consult and when not to. But I think it is always to be encouraged.
Well, then, shall we?
I just want to get just one other thing. I just want to just say something because, of course, the Benin bronzes and the Parthenon sculptures were part of your presentation. they're perhaps exceptional in certain ways. I think the fundamental purpose of a museum is preservation. And quite often the act of preservation does entail removing something from one place and putting it into another place which is safer. And I think if we look at, for example, the history of cultural material in many parts of the world, the process of actually preservation has not taken place. Occasionally a curator turns up, removes certain things, usually actually without any fuss or bother, because there's no one actually in charge of anything, brings them back to London, and they are, from that point onwards, pretty safe for everyone to see and to do research on and conduct research on, all the rest of it. So I'm a bit worried about the discussion, which I think will lead from your excellent talk, which will only end up with, should the Parthenon sculptures go back to Athens?
Well, I know that's not a controversial issue here in Britain, so we don't have to talk about that. I think one of the considerations has to be, if we're going to restitute this thing, what's going to happen to it? As I said in my remarks, one would not restitute works of art to a war zone. One would not restitute them to a society that doesn't have a functioning space to take care of them. But it is patronizing to make the judgment, absent lots of evidence, that we just don't think you're up to it. We have to figure that out. And in the case of the Benin bronzes, for example, the Nigerian government is creating a museum that is intended to be a world-class museum. We'll have to see, but I think one needs to be mindful of all of the considerations and be respectful of the people we're dealing with. But you have to protect the art. You do have a responsibility not to discharge the object to a party that will not responsibly care for it.
Yep.
I feel a tremendous pressure from the audience. You'll have to
really, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm a Francis Ford. I'm a Hartford, so I know nothing about this. But I want to touch upon two ethical points that I don't think we have touched upon yet, and that is inter-institutional competition for new acquisitions. Having spent quite a bit of time with the Getty, I do know that there was a period of time when the Getty purchased from the audience, everybody went home because of funding. I'd like to hear your opinion on that, how you actually acquire what you'd like to do. And the second thing is the number of objects that are obscured in the basement of these institutions that never see the light of day. And no one, for example, us in the public, know what you've got, what you could have, or what you could show, and what you do to try and expose that wonderful collection that is our culture.
Yes, thank you for your questions, both excellent questions. I think, first of all, with regard to competition for collections, there is always some of that. But actually, the truth is that for most objects that one wants, the competition isn't coming from other institutions. It's coming from private collectors with resources exponentially greater than the Metropolitan. So what we have learned, and I think the Getty is getting the hang of this too, but the Met has learned it, and most museums have, it's a lot more effective to collect collectors and then let them buy these objects and then give them to us when they're done with them. And that is how, if one looks at the Met, had nothing in 1870, zero art. And the collection today is among the finest in the world. Every single object in that collection, every single one was given to us by someone. Every one, or the money was given to us. And so it's efficient to collect collectors because they create something that matters to them. It is to be sure not always the case, and one wants to be as responsible as one can, but art auctions they're a certain kind of capital market that is not always rational, and that it's good to keep your wits about you. When most museums set a budget for an object, and then when they send the person out into the auction wilderness, they tell them, don't spend more than, you don't raise your hand after it's $500,000. So you do the best you can to control an irrational process rationally. With regard to storage, it is an interesting problem, although I think there's a very different approach that, again, many museums in the US actively deaccession their collections all the time, including the Met. The question is, what are you deaccessioning, for what purpose, and what's happening to those objects? As a museum moves through a process of elevating the quality of its collections, inevitably things end up consigned in the storage rooms because they're not good enough for the galleries they were originally in. It is not a service to anyone for them to be cared for in the basement until the end of time. So those objects should be deaccessioned if, in the professional judgment of the curators, especially the conservators, the object is better served, and the world is better served by them being deaccessioned. The British Museum has, and you are the expert on this, has a very different philosophy that's related to its mission. But in any given year at the Metropolitan, we're deaccessioning hundreds of objects. Not as many as we're getting, but there is a deaccession program. Sometimes one makes a mistake and deaccessions something that turns out to be an important collection, but usually not. I think you have to have a healthy process of turnover in the collection, even if you are a repository of materials that is intended to live forever, because these are living institutions.
Yes, but I mean, I think, Darren, one has to take into account the cost of deaccessioning. It costs a lot of money actually to get rid of something. In terms of time, it's much more efficient to acquire than to deaccession. As far as the other part of the collection is concerned, you know, the dusty museum basements image. The British Museum is, and I'm sure the Metropolitan Museum is as well, is computerizing the records of its collection. I know, for example, the prints and drawings collection of the British Museum, 2 million items, are all accessible on the British Museum website now. And that sort of program, I'm sure, will continue.
Yeah, it makes a big
Let's
difference.
take another question. So I think we are morally obligated to the gentleman who gave up his opportunity.
So hi, I'm Adham. I do philosophy. So I think, I mean, that's my impression. Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, most of the talk and the discussion were sort of on the side of the managerial side of, you know, managing a museum, and talked about the sort of virtues of governance, sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. But these are only sort of derivative questions from the value questions, right? In terms of what is the actual cultural mission of any given museum, right? And in particular, maybe you can give example for the Metropolitan Museum. So this kind of the broader specific question is like, so what are the values? And then what are, kind of, as of you sort of on the head of a board of trustees, I mean, you make particular decisions guided by particular values, kind of aesthetic values, civic values about what gets exhibited and included, right? And the sort of second branch of the question, like a museum like the Metropolitan, a big museum like that, this kind of has two strands going on. There's kind of, as you said, kind of the encyclopedic / universalist aspect to it, but displaying various things, right? And then there's another aspect, which is kind of telling particular narratives and particular stories, right? And these perhaps are different outcomes that might be guided by different values. So I was wondering what you think about that. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you for your question. I would say that most museums have three fundamental aspects of their mission. One is to preserve in a responsible way the collections that they are stewarding, whatever that means, whether it's the British Museum or the Met or whatever. They have objects they must care for. Part of their obligation is to preserve in perpetuity the material legacy that they're responsible for. The second is, at some level, at the Metropolitan, it's very significant, at others less, to create knowledge. That the Met, I often thought in my years at the Met that we were functioning much more like a cultural university than a conventional art museum, given what it is that we do. And it is to create, but every museum does this at some level, to create knowledge, to add to the story and understanding of the material culture that they are stewarding one way or the other. And that means research in various kinds of ways. And the third part is to educate and present that material and those ideas in ways that serves the community's greater interest over the longer term. And those are the three core elements of a mission. So we spoke a great deal about the ethical museum this evening, which inevitably didn't take us into discussions about particular programmatic visions or collecting strategies. Those are by rights delegated in the same way a university delegates to academic departments what they teach and what they research. In the same way, no self-respecting art museum director is going to set out that agenda at a granular level for all the departments any more than Alan is going to tell the members of his community what they should be working on. That Alan would not be here next year if he did that. That isn't his job. And so I think it's finding that balance, but inspiring people to fulfill that mission in a way that is consistent with the overall aspirations of the institution. And I think if you get that right, then magic things happen, and they are often surprises, just as Robert was talking about. The second part of your question, I'm sorry, was there was another aspect to your question?
Yeah, I don't want to take more time, so.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Here we are. Microphone taking. Two microphones taking.
A three-body collision.
Maybe just minus.
Yes, sorry, I'm David Cope and I'm a fellow at Clare Hall. What are you doing to increase the throughput of people coming to your museum? There must be a physical limit, I'm sure, but how are you reaching out to get those New Yorkers who through their taxes are subsidizing, as you told us, who don't come currently, to actually come? And do you see that as part of your ethical remit?
Yes, indeed, I do. We could have spoken about that this evening. The interesting paradox is that we would all agree that the best museum experience is when you're in there by yourself. It's unlike the theater. You don't want to be the only one in the seat when you're watching a performance, but in a museum, people were always asking me, can I come after hours and see this thing without the noisy public? But that said, our mission is to connect people. Every museum does that. The British Museum, I've never gotten closer than maybe 5 rows to the Rosetta Stone ever. It just doesn't happen. That's part of the problem. For the Metropolitan, the strategy, there was a lot of careful thought given to who are the audiences that are not coming. Mostly it were people who lived in the surrounding areas, what are called the boroughs in New York, and Staten Island and Queens and Brooklyn, and who don't think of the museum as theirs. They show up and see this grand facade and they're quite sure they're not welcome there. So how do you break that down? We discovered one way forward was to find school children where they are. And if you're a school child in Staten Island, for example, which is very far away, they aren't coming because the schools don't have money for buses. So the Met provided the buses. That we'll provide buses. And what we learned is if we can bring school children in once or twice and they see how to go in the building, where you get your tickets, where the restrooms are, they come back with their parents. And if you show up at a place like the British Museum once or twice or 3 times, or the Met, it becomes yours for the rest of your life. So the gift we can give them is an understanding of what that access looks like. That's one audience, school kids. But the creative challenge is that one can, as it were, segment the market of the public in a million different ways. There are lots of ways of thinking about audiences. And there are certainly sectors of the public that don't think of the Met as a place that would be of interest to them. We think about creative programming. For example, and you're all going to laugh because you don't think of it as an outreach strategy, perhaps, but the Costume Institute at the Met. They do this thing each year called the Party of the Year, which it's the largest public media event of any event on the planet. And it gravitates to excessive very quickly. But people come to see that, and then they can't help it. They notice the Assyrian art, or they happen to notice the Italian masterpiece. And if we can reach people in some way that brings them in and gives them an experience that opens up the possibilities of learning, we've done something. But the creative challenge is finding people in a world there's change all the time. We all thought that the advent of these things will end the museum, and it hasn't, but we have to figure out how to use these things in ways that enriches their experience. That's the brilliance of what a good professional staff can figure out.
Just to say a word, David, one of the problems we had in the British Museum was to try to attract certain ethnic minorities that it was a worthwhile experience to come to the museum. And I have to say that we quite often failed in that, even though we tried to put on exhibitions which are not only curated by representatives of these communities, but also obviously looking at the subject matter. It was difficult, and as I say, I mean, the trouble with museum people is they always look to the success and wonderfulness of their institutions. There are failures, and we have to accept that.
That's true.
Hi, my name is Diego. I'm a PhD student in the university, and my question is about property. So you spoke about 2 cases that about property. The first one was the donator that somehow involved the Greek government in order to accept the donation. And if you could share a little bit more about that process, because in my perspective, it's some sort of circumvention. If you claim property, but then you don't have any right over the object you claim property, just seems abusively symbolic. And the second one is giving back the property and distinguishing between either nations or countries in war zone or that don't have the facilities to conserve such arts of work or representative of history. But it seems to me that you could give back those the property of those objects immediately, and maybe just set the physical devolution or condition the physical devolution to the compliance of certain criteria. But I just don't see why that could be an excuse not to to devolve those artworks or those objects, which leads me to ask you, which do you think should be the underlying conception of property in museums? Because in some ways, this understanding, when you're speaking about legally acquired and so on, seems a very capitalist formal understanding of property versus other more cultural, historic understandings of property. So which one do you think should be the concept of property? And if this should be consistent or not between private and public museums?
I'm not quite sure I understood the question very well. My hearing's not wonderful. But I think I'd ask a very simple question. Is the Encyclopedic Museum worth preserving? In my view, it is.
According to according to whom?
I would offer a different frame. I don't think it's a binary question. I don't think the way you propose the scenarios lends itself to all the possible answers. In the case of, say, the Cycladic material, within our laws and within the framework of the ethical obligations that we feel, we did not believe it was appropriate for us to accept a gift of works of art that did not have the kind of provenance and clear history of ownership that ultimately would devolve back to Greece, because that's where they all came from. So the lowest common denominator in that case is they started at some point there, and we don't know what their journey was. So we thought the right approach was to understand there is a property rights issue here that can be solved by restituting those or having the donor give them to the Greek government. But there's the practical issue that how is society, Greek culture, the world best served by the disposition of those objects? There was, to be sure, a risk. They could be given back to the Greeks, the Greek government, and they could say, okay, we're done. That was a risk we were willing to take. But they shared our view that specific ownership rights are a distinct matter. The Greek government has a vested interest in preserving its legal rights to works of art that come from their society, and we respect that. But they don't need those Cycladic arts to tell the story of that aspect of their culture, because they have plenty. So I think this notion that I'm talking about is collaboration in a spirit of mission fulfillment is actually a way forward that is viable across a whole range of activities and areas. I think to your other question about restituting objects to getting past the issue of whether if they're all set up to have them in a safe way, should we restitute them? The problem is that the answer legally, ethically, isn't always so clear. The Benin bronzes is a very good example. It's a controversial issue, to be sure, but the objects that were taken were not, as it were, taken illegally in 1897 during the punitive raid. There are ethical issues for sure, but there are 156 museums around the world that own those objects legally. There are owners who've acquired them. There's a whole network of complicated constellations of ownership that have to be adjudicated in a way to sort that out. The way forward isn't going to be that way. It's going to be through networks of cooperation where the greater good is achieved in an imperfect way, rather than the perfection of one trial after another for 3,500 objects. That's just not happening. So I think we have to recognize it is not a binary as you proposed it, even though that's a framework to think about.
Yes, I think there are various issues about those who are attempting to restitute material. One certainly is obviously the cultural matter, but I think quite often these arguments are used to promote other kinds of arguments. And I think one's got to be careful that one knows exactly what one is being asked for.
I think very, very sadly, we have to draw things. We look at the they said, we say, have a bit volatile shit. Thank Daniel.
Thank you, Reg.
very much. This is the final debate. Look forward to the-
Thank you. That is live.
Well,